In a world where a simple drive to work can become a moment that exposes the deepest fractures in our society, one story stands out as both shocking and painfully predictable. What would you do if an officer accused you of stealing your own car? How would you react if, despite your accomplishments, your identity, your dignity, and your humanity were all overshadowed by the color of your skin? Today's story is not just another headline, it's a mirror held up to a system that continues to struggle with bias, perception, and justice. And in this case, the mirror is held by someone who understands the law better than anyone else involved, a respected state Supreme Court judge. Welcome to Swift Tale, where we explore powerful stories, untold truths, and moments that challenge us to think deeper. If this is your first time visiting the channel, let me ask you a simple question. Would you like to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss another story that matters? Because today's journey is one every viewer should take. Imagine a quiet morning, the kind of morning where routine feels comforting, familiar roads, predictable traffic, and the simple intention of getting from one place to another. Now imagine that routine being shattered by flashing lights, a raised hand commanding you to stop, and a voice that already assumes the worst. This is exactly what happened to a black man behind the wheel of a perfectly legal, perfectly registered vehicle. Except this wasn't just any man. This was a man who had dedicated his life to interpreting the law, upholding justice, and serving the public at the highest level. He was a state Supreme Court judge, a title that carries immense respect, responsibility, and trust. Yet in the eyes of the officer who pulled him over, none of that mattered. What mattered, apparently, was the assumption that a black man couldn't possibly own the luxury car he was driving. And so the accusation came swiftly, bluntly, and without evidence. This isn't your car. Today, we're diving deep into a story that reaches far beyond one traffic stop. It's a story that echoes the experiences of countless black individuals who have been questioned, doubted, or criminalized simply for existing in certain spaces. But what makes this incident particularly striking is not just who it happened to, but what it reveals about the complexities of race, authority, and perception in America. If a state Supreme Court judge can be treated like a suspect without reason, what does that mean for ordinary citizens who don't have titles, influence, or an institution behind them? What does it say about the systems meant to protect us all equally? These are the questions that lie at the heart of today's exploration. As we unravel the details of the encounter, I want you to keep something in mind. This is not an isolated story. It's part of a long, painful pattern, a thread woven through decades of mistrust, misunderstanding, and at times, outright discrimination. Yet it's also a story filled with lessons, opportunities, and a chance to reflect on what justice should look like. And that is precisely why it matters. When someone who interprets the law at the highest level becomes the target of its misuse, the consequences go far beyond embarrassment or inconvenience. They expose a reality that demands attention, reform, and accountability. Here on Swift Tale, we believe in telling stories that make us think, stories that challenge us to confront uncomfortable truths while inspiring us to seek better solutions. This incident is not just about one officer and one driver. It's about the broader system that shaped that moment. It's about the assumptions that influenced the officer's judgment. It's about the shock and frustration that the judge felt when his professional identity and personal dignity were cast aside in an instant. It's about every viewer watching this who has ever felt unseen, unheard, or unfairly judged. In today's video, we'll walk through the events leading up to the stop, the conversation that unfolded on the roadside, and the moment everything changed. The moment the officer realized that the man he was accusing was, in fact, a powerful figure in the very justice system the officer worked within. We'll explore how the judge reacted, how the public responded, and how this incident sparked conversations nationwide. We'll look at the media coverage, the debates, the questions raised in homes, courtrooms, and communities across the country. And most importantly, we'll break down what this moment teaches us about the ongoing fight against racial profiling and the pursuit of justice that is truly equal. By the time we reach the end of this video, I hope you'll not only understand the details of the incident, but also feel the emotional weight behind it, the disbelief, the disappointment, the anger, and ultimately the urgency. Because if we want a future where stories like this no longer happen, it requires awareness, accountability, and action from all of us. So sit back, stay engaged, and let's take this journey together. You're watching Swift Tale, and this is the story of a cop who accused a black man of stealing his own car, only to discover that man was a state Supreme Court judge. Let's begin to truly understand the weight of this incident. We have to step back and look at the larger landscape that made it possible. Racial profiling in the United States is not a recent phenomenon, nor is it a collection of unrelated incidents that occasionally make the news. It is a deeply rooted pattern, a consequence of history, perception, and policy that has shaped the relationship between law enforcement and marginalized communities for generations. When a black man is accused of stealing his own car, the moment does not exist in isolation. It's wrapped in a long legacy of assumptions about race, threat, ownership, and belonging. And while many people may believe that progress over the years has eliminated such biases, the reality tells a very different story. From the earliest days of policing in America, law enforcement wasn't simply created to keep peace. It was built, in part, to enforce social hierarchies. Slave patrols in the South, discriminatory vagrancy laws after Reconstruction, and the aggressive policing of black neighborhoods during the Jim Crow era all laid the foundation for modern forms of racial control. Even as laws evolved, the perception of blackness as inherently suspicious lingered. Over time, these early practices hardened into modern policing norms, creating an environment where certain bodies are more likely to be stopped, questioned, searched, or assumed guilty. This historical context doesn't excuse any individual officer's actions, but it explains why these situations continue to occur with painful regularity. As America entered the late 20th century, new policies only intensified the divide. The war on drugs, for example, disproportionately targeted black and brown people despite research showing nearly identical rates of drug use across races. Traffic stops became one of the most common stages where these disparities played out. Black drivers, particularly black men, reported being stopped far more frequently than white drivers, even in instances where crime rates and traffic behavior couldn't justify the difference. Studies consistently demonstrated the same trend. Black drivers were more likely to be pulled over, more likely to be searched, and less likely to have done anything wrong. In other words, the suspicion often existed before the stop began. One phenomenon that emerged from these patterns became known as driving while black. It's a phrase that may sound sarcastic or exaggerated to some, but to millions, it describes a real and recurring experience. Over the decades, countless individuals have come forward with stories of being stopped for vague reasons. Their car looked too nice, they were in the wrong neighborhood, or an officer claimed to smell something that conveniently justified a search. These moments, while sometimes lasting only minutes, leave lasting emotional scars. They reinforce the message that no matter how educated, successful, or accomplished a black person might be, the first judgment may still be rooted in stereotype rather than reality. The consequences of racial profiling extend far beyond inconvenience or embarrassment. For many, traffic stops become sources of trauma, fear, and humiliation. Families teach their children the rules of interacting with police. Keep your hands visible, don't reach for anything too quickly, speak calmly, narrate your movements, not because these children have done anything wrong, but because their safety depends on anticipating how an officer might perceive them. This emotional burden, carried silently across generations, becomes part of everyday life. And while some may argue that these fears are exaggerated, the steady stream of high-profile cases proves otherwise. From traffic stops that escalated into violence to mistaken identity arrests and unjust searches, the pattern is undeniable. But racial profiling doesn't only harm civilians, it also erodes the credibility of law enforcement. When certain communities feel targeted or unprotected, trust in police weakens. People become less willing to report crimes, cooperate with investigations, or view officers as allies. Trust, once broken, is incredibly hard to rebuild. Many police departments across the country have attempted reform, from bias training to body cameras, but the results vary widely. Some officers embrace transparency and community engagement, while others view these efforts as burdensome or unnecessary. The inconsistency means that reforms often depend more on local culture and leadership than on nationwide standards. To complicate matters further, racial profiling often hides behind vague justifications, a furtive movement, a look of suspicion, or an officer's gut feeling. These subjective phrases give officers broad discretion, allowing personal bias to blend seamlessly with professional judgment. Even well-intentioned officers can fall victim to implicit bias, the unconscious associations we make without realizing it. In many cases, the officer may genuinely believe they're acting appropriately, unaware that their assumptions have been shaped by years of societal messages linking blackness with danger or criminality. This is not merely a matter of personal prejudice. It's a reflection of cultural conditioning, media portrayals, and systemic patterns that reinforce the same harmful narratives. This is where the story of a state Supreme Court judge being accused of stealing his own car becomes so significant. It illustrates that racial profiling is not something overcome by status or success. It doesn't dissolve when someone earns degrees, titles, or public recognition. The judge's experience shows that the bias embedded within the system operates independently of an individual's achievements. If a man who interprets state law for a living can still be misidentified as a criminal out of sheer assumption, then it raises an uncomfortable but necessary question. What hope do ordinary citizens have? This is a question echoed by civil rights organizations, legal scholars, and community leaders who have long argued that the battle against profiling is far from over. Yet within this troubling reality lies an opportunity, the chance to confront these patterns honestly and work toward meaningful change. Awareness is the first step. Understanding the history, the data, the lived experiences of those affected gives us the language and tools to challenge the status quo. This story, like so many others, forces us to acknowledge that racial profiling is not simply a matter of a bad apple officer or a moment of poor judgment. It is the visible tip of a much deeper system shaped by history, culture, and policy. As we move forward into the next sections of this video, it's important to hold this context in mind, because the incident involving the judge is not merely an overreaction or a misunderstanding. It is a symptom of a far larger issue that spans decades. To understand how and why the officer reacted the way he did, we must understand the environment that shaped his assumptions. And to understand why this incident struck such a powerful chord across the nation, we must recognize how it connects to the broader fight for justice, equality, and dignity. To understand the full gravity of this incident, we need to know the man at the center of it, not as a headline, not as a victim of profiling, but as a human being whose life story stands in sharp contrast to the assumptions made by the officer who pulled him over. Before he became the subject of a viral encounter, he was known for his sharp legal mind, his dedication to justice, and his reputation as someone who rose from humble beginnings to one of the highest judicial positions in his state. His life wasn't defined by what happened during that traffic stop. It was defined by decades of persistence, excellence, and service, all of which make the incident even more striking. Because when you learn who he is, where he came from, what he fought for, and what he accomplished, the moment of being accused of stealing his own car becomes not just an insult, but a painful reminder of how deeply rooted prejudice can overshadow even the brightest achievements. Born into a modest family in a working-class neighborhood, he was the kind of child who understood early on that education could open doors others thought were locked. His parents, though not wealthy, instilled in him values that would guide his life: work hard, stay honest, and never stop reaching. His mother often told him that knowledge was a kind of armor, one that could protect him in a world that would not always see him as equal. Those words stayed with him as he moved through school, excelling in subjects that others found daunting. Teachers described him as curious, determined, and unusually mature. He was the kind of student who didn't just complete assignments. He asked questions, challenged assumptions, and looked for deeper meaning. These traits would one day become the foundation of his legal brilliance. His path to the legal profession wasn't straightforward. There were obstacles, financial strain, moments of doubt, and times when he felt the weight of being one of the few black students in academic spaces not designed with him in mind. Yet each setback only strengthened his resolve. He earned scholarships, worked part-time jobs, and carved out a place for himself where many said he didn't belong. When he was accepted into a prestigious law school, it was a triumph not just for him, but for everyone who had supported his journey. In law school, he quickly gained a reputation for his powerful writing, sharp analytical thinking, and ability to remain calm and collected even under pressure, a trait that later made him an exceptional judge. After graduating, he began his legal career not in lucrative corporate law, but in public service. He believed the law was a tool for fairness and justice, and he wanted to use it to uplift people who often didn't have a voice. He worked as a public defender, representing clients who had been overlooked, underestimated, or unfairly treated by the system. His dedication didn't go unnoticed. He fought fiercely for his clients, not because he saw them as case files, but because he saw them as human beings worthy of dignity. Over time, he became known for his fairness, empathy, and unwavering commitment to the truth, qualities that set him apart in a system too often driven by bureaucracy rather than humanity. His rise through the legal ranks was swift but well-earned. He served as a civil rights attorney, then a trial judge, then an appellate judge, each role sharpening his understanding of the law from different angles. Colleagues described him as the type of judge who read every case thoroughly, considered every argument carefully, and treated everyone in the courtroom with respect, whether they wore a suit or handcuffs. He was admired not only for his legal intellect, but for his integrity. His rulings were thoughtful, clear, balanced, and rooted in a deep belief that justice should never be influenced by race, status, or the opinions of those in power. When he was finally appointed to the state Supreme Court, it wasn't just a personal victory. It was a historic moment. He became one of the few black justices to serve at that level, a symbol of progress in a system that had long excluded people who looked like him. Journalists interviewed him, community groups celebrated him, and young students looked up to him as proof that barriers could be broken. Despite accolades and recognition, he remained humble, often saying that he viewed his role not as a position of prestige, but as a responsibility to interpret the law fairly, protect the vulnerable, and uphold the principles of democracy. Over the years, he authored influential opinions that shaped state policy, protected civil liberties, and clarified important constitutional questions. He became known for his steady demeanor, even in the face of political pressure. Colleagues admired his ability to separate emotion from judgment without ever losing compassion. In addition to his judicial work, he was heavily involved in community outreach, giving lectures at schools, speaking at town halls, and mentoring young aspiring lawyers, especially students of color who rarely saw themselves represented on the bench. Yet for all his accomplishments, he remained grounded. He preferred simple routines, driving himself to work, spending time with his family, reading on quiet evenings, and enjoying long drives where he could think through complex legal questions. He didn't flaunt his status or position. He didn't surround himself with security or insist on special treatment. He believed that being a judge meant serving the public, not standing above it. And that is precisely why the traffic stop struck such a powerful chord. Here was a man who had dedicated his entire life to upholding justice, a man who reached one of the highest positions in the judicial system, a man who believed deeply in fairness, being reduced to a stereotype in a matter of seconds. His title didn't protect him. His achievements didn't shield him. His years of service didn't change the officer's initial assumption that a black man in a nice car must have taken it from someone else. The disconnect between who he truly was and how he was perceived in that moment is not just ironic, it is heartbreaking. Because when a state Supreme Court judge, someone who embodies the ideals of justice, can still be subjected to racial bias, it reveals a painful truth. No level of success can fully erase the prejudices built into society's expectations and fears. His life story, filled with perseverance, dedication, and triumph, stands as a stark reminder that racial profiling does not discriminate based on status. It strikes without warning, without reason, and without regard for who the person really is. And that is why knowing his background matters. This incident wasn't just a misunderstanding between a driver and an officer. It was an encounter between a man who spent his life fighting for justice and a system still struggling to deliver it. As we move forward into the next sections, we will see how this moment unfolded and why his identity as a judge made the officer's assumption not only wrong, but deeply symbolic. On the morning of the incident, nothing about the day suggested that it would become etched into national conversation. It began as one of those quiet, predictable mornings where the air feels calm and the world seems to move at a steady, unremarkable pace. The sun had just started to climb, casting a warm, amber glow over the neighborhood as commuters prepared for their day. It was the kind of morning where people sip their coffee a little slower, breathe a little deeper, and settle into the familiar rhythm of routine. The judge, like countless others across the country, left his home with the simple intention of heading to work, mentally preparing for the cases he would be reviewing, the decisions he would need to make, and the responsibilities awaiting him at the state Supreme Court. Nothing in his demeanor reflected uncertainty or tension. To him, it was just another day. The streets he traveled were ones he knew well-kept suburban roads lined with trees and quiet homes, slowly giving way to busier intersections as he approached the city center. The neighborhoods he passed through reflected a mix of residential comfort and urban life, each block carrying stories of its own. Joggers moved along sidewalks, kids waited for school buses, and shop owners began lifting shutters to welcome the day. This was a community that, on the surface, embraced calm and order. Yet beneath that surface, like in so many places across America, the relationship between law enforcement and certain parts of the population was complicated. Some residents viewed police presence as a reassurance, others viewed it as a threat. That tension, subtle, quiet, but ever-present, lingered in the air, even on a peaceful morning like this one. As the judge drove, he was focused but relaxed, his mind drifting between personal thoughts and professional obligations. He often used his morning commute as a form of mental preparation, reflecting on legal principles, reviewing arguments he'd encounter in court, or simply enjoying a rare moment of solitude before a demanding day. His car, a well-maintained and modestly luxurious vehicle, wasn't flashy or extravagant, but it was unmistakably the kind of car someone of his position and success could own without question. Or at least, that's what one would assume in a society free from bias. But as this story shows, assumptions play a powerful role in shaping reality. Meanwhile, a police officer patrolled the same streets, scanning the flow of traffic as he moved into the area. His day had also begun routinely, with the usual responsibilities, observing drivers, watching for minor infractions, and responding to calls as needed. Nothing out of the ordinary had crossed his path yet, but it only takes a single moment, sometimes a glance, sometimes a gut feeling, to alter the course of an ordinary morning. And as the officer drove in the opposite direction of the judge, their paths crossed in a way that would soon become the center of national attention. The environment around them seemed peaceful, but the officer's mindset was far more alert. Officers often describe a heightened state of awareness, a level of constant observation trained over years. They're taught to notice what others overlook: a slight turn signal error, a vehicle slowing unexpectedly, a driver who appears distracted. But they are also, sometimes unconsciously, influenced by biases and stereotypes that have seeped into the profession over decades. In this moment, the officer noticed the judge's car, not because it was violating any laws, not because it posed any threat, but because something about the image of a black man driving a well-kept vehicle triggered a suspicion. And that suspicion, even if unspoken, set the stage for everything that followed. The judge, meanwhile, remained unaware of the monitoring eyes behind him. He was thinking through a legal brief, the kind that demanded careful analysis and attention to detail. He had no reason to expect anything unusual from the day. As he approached a stoplight, the faint sound of a police car repositioning itself behind him caught his attention, not enough to alarm him, but enough to break his concentration. He glanced into his rearview mirror with the same cautious awareness that many black drivers learn early in life. At first, he saw nothing alarming: no flashing lights, no sirens, just a patrol car maintaining distance. He continued driving, assuming the officer would soon pass or turn. But the officer didn't pass. Instead, he followed closely, observing the vehicle as if waiting for a reason, any reason, to initiate a stop. Sometimes, in these moments, silence speaks louder than words. The police car's presence lingered like a question mark hanging over the judge's morning. And eventually, the question turned into a command when the officer switched on his lights. Red and blue reflections danced across the judge's dashboard. The calm of the morning shifted instantly into a moment of tension. The judge pulled over to the side of the road with the same respect for the law he had upheld his entire career. He followed the procedure he had explained to countless defendants, litigants, and even students during guest lectures. Signal, slow down, stop, hands visible, wait. He wasn't worried about a ticket, he wasn't even certain why he'd been stopped. What he felt instead was a sense of confusion mixed with a familiar sinking feeling. For many black men, no matter their status or achievements, a police stop carries weight that can't be measured by ordinary standards. It carries history, personal, generational, and societal. The location of the stop was a quiet stretch of road framed by trees and modest homes. Neighbors went about their routines, unaware that a moment of injustice was unfolding only yards away. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and the world continued as if nothing unusual was happening. Yet inside that moment, between the officer stepping out of his patrol car and the judge waiting behind the wheel, an encounter shaped by centuries of inequity was about to take place. And this is where the story truly begins, not with flashing lights or raised voices, but with two men on opposite ends of the justice system meeting on a quiet road during an ordinary morning. One man carried the authority of the law. The other carried the weight of living beneath its biases. Their worlds were about to collide, and nothing, not the peaceful morning, not the routine commute, not even the judge's prestigious position, could prevent what was coming next. The moment the patrol car's lights flashed behind him, the judge felt a familiar jolt of tension shoot through his chest, a feeling that countless black drivers know all too well. Even though he had done nothing wrong, even though his record was clean, even though he upheld the law for a living, the sudden shift in atmosphere was unmistakable. What had moments earlier been a peaceful commute was now a scene heavy with anticipation. He took a slow breath, reminded himself to stay calm, and did what he had done so many times before, pulled over safely, turned off his engine, placed both hands visibly on the steering wheel, and waited. He knew the protocol. He knew the expectations. He knew this ritual of compliance that black men practice instinctively, not because they're guilty, but because they're aware of the stakes. The officer approached slowly at first, hand hovering near his holster in the cautious stance taught in police academies. But there was something else in his posture, a premature conclusion, a certainty that the stop was necessary, justified, and urgent. Instead of greeting the judge with professionalism or neutrality, the officer's first words landed sharp and accusatory. He didn't ask whether the judge knew why he had been stopped. He didn't mention a traffic violation. Instead, he went straight to suspicion, license and registration. Is this your vehicle? The tone carried an edge, not merely of authority, but of doubt, the kind of doubt that suggested the officer assumed the answer before even asking the question. The judge, maintaining calm, responded politely. Yes, officer, this is my car. May I ask what the issue is? His voice was composed, steady, and careful. He had spent a lifetime mastering the art of composed communication, in courtrooms, in interviews, and in public settings. But even the most poised voice can't erase the undercurrent of insult that comes when a man of his stature is treated as a suspect in a situation where no crime exists. Instead of answering, the officer glanced into the car, scanning the interior as if searching for something that wasn't there: stolen merchandise, broken locks, signs of forced entry, or anything to justify the suspicion he carried like a shield. When he found nothing, he pressed further. You're sure this is your car? Can you prove that? His tone hardened, as if the judge's calmness itself was suspicious. The judge felt a knot tighten in his stomach, but his face remained controlled. He reached slowly, narrating each movement, for his wallet. I am going to get my driver's license now, he said clearly, the practiced warning that black parents teach their sons from the time they are old enough to drive. The officer nodded stiffly, but his hand remained hovering near his weapon. That detail alone told the judge everything he needed to know. This stop wasn't about safety or procedure. It was about an assumption that a black man behind the wheel of a nice car must be doing something wrong. As the judge handed over his license, the officer looked down, reading the name printed in bold letters. For a moment, the officer paused, not long enough to shift the atmosphere, just long enough for confusion to flicker across his face. The name was familiar, though the officer didn't immediately place it. Registration, he demanded next, still in the same tone. The judge retrieved the vehicle registration, again narrating his movements, again keeping his actions slow and visible. The officer took it, glanced at it briefly, and then stepped back toward his patrol car. Inside the patrol car, the officer ran the judge's information through the system. The results came back fast, confirming that the car was indeed registered to the man he had pulled over. But instead of interpreting this as evidence that everything was fine, the officer grew more suspicious. Why would someone like this, a man with a clean record, a perfectly matched registration, and no prior incidents, be driving a vehicle that the officer felt didn't fit him? That unspoken bias inhabited the spaces between facts, shaping the officer's choices. He returned to the driver's window with a new level of aggression. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered sharply. The judge blinked, surprised. "Officer, may I ask why you need me to step out?" It was a fair, calm question, the kind any innocent driver would ask, but the officer interpreted it as defiance. "Sir, I said step out of the vehicle. Don't make this difficult." The shift in tone was unmistakable. The judge's heart pounded harder. He knew he had grounds to refuse, but he also knew such refusals often ended disastrously for men who looked like him. So he complied, opening the door slowly and stepping out with his hands visible. The officer immediately directed him to stand near the rear of the vehicle. It wasn't an arrest, not formally, but the power dynamics suggested otherwise. At this point, neighbors began to peek from windows, and passing drivers slowed down, curious about the tension in the air. The judge felt exposed, not just physically, but emotionally, intellectually, and symbolically. Here he was, a man whose legal opinions influenced state policy, standing on the side of the road being treated like a suspect in broad daylight. The contradictions strung deeply. As the officer questioned him further, about where he was going, where he had been, how he afforded the car, the tone remained cold and accusatory. The officer didn't phrase his questions neutrally. They came laced with assumptions. Each one implied guilt. Each one carried the weight of racial stereotype. And through it all, the judge answered calmly, steadily, refusing to let anger cloud his responses. But inside, he felt a mix of frustration, disbelief, and an old, familiar pain, the pain of being judged not by his accomplishments, but by the color of his skin. The tension reached its peak when the officer muttered the words that would soon ignite public outrage. "This car doesn't look like something you'd be driving. Tell me again how you got it." The implication was unmistakable. The judge, for a moment, closed his eyes, steadying himself. He had spoken at conferences about racial profiling. He had mentored young lawyers facing discrimination. He had written opinions protecting civil rights. Yet in that moment, none of it mattered. His identity, his title, his lifetime of service were invisible to the man standing in front of him. Only the stereotype remained. And so, standing on a quiet roadside on an ordinary morning, the judge realized that this traffic stop was no longer simply an inconvenience. It was a reflection of a much deeper issue woven into the fabric of the society he served. What began as a routine commute had become a powerful symbol of the bias that continues to shape law enforcement encounters across the country. The moment the officer uttered those words, "This isn't your car," the atmosphere shifted from tense to surreal. It wasn't just an accusation, it was a declaration. It carried the weight of assumption, disbelief, and quiet hostility. For a brief moment, the judge wondered if he had heard correctly. In all his years of public service, in all his experiences with the justice system both inside and outside the courtroom, he had encountered countless situations shaped by race, bias, and misunderstanding. But hearing those words directed at him in broad daylight on an ordinary morning felt like a blow that struck deeper than the officer realized. It wasn't merely about a vehicle. It was about identity, dignity, and belonging. The officer stood stiffly, shoulders squared, eyes unblinking as he repeated his claim. "I don't believe this car belongs to you. Tell me again where you got it." There was no evidence to support his suspicion, no broken ignition, no mismatched plates, no erratic driving behavior, nothing. And yet, in the officer's mind, the conclusion had already been made the moment he saw a black man behind the wheel of a well-maintained vehicle. The officer wasn't asking a question. He was accusing. He was looking for inconsistencies. He was fishing for a confession to a crime that didn't exist. For a long second, the judge simply stared at him, trying to comprehend how easily the officer dismissed the documents he'd already verified. The registration matched. The name matched. The records showed no theft, no discrepancy. Still, the officer clung to his belief, as if the truth in front of him was less convincing than the stereotype in his mind. The judge's composed exterior hid an internal storm, the disbelief, the frustration, the quiet humiliation of being told he didn't own the property he had worked his entire life to afford. "I've told you," the judge replied calmly, though each word carried tension, "this is my vehicle. My registration and license confirm that." His tone was polite but assertive, the tone of a man used to being heard, used to speaking from authority. But the officer wasn't listening, not to his words, not to the facts, not to reason. Instead, the officer leaned in slightly, squinting as if the judge's calmness was a sign of guilt. "People forge documents," he said flatly. "Happens all the time." It was a hollow justification, one that revealed more about the officer's mindset than about any actual wrongdoing. The judge felt a ripple of anger rise in his chest, not uncontrolled or explosive, but deep and righteous. He knew this wasn't about forged documents, it was about perception. It was about a belief, shaped long before this moment, that a man who looked like him could not possibly possess success without suspicion. The silence that followed was heavy. The judge took a slow breath, not wanting to escalate the situation, not wanting the officer to interpret emotion as threat. Years of experience had taught him that calmness was not just a virtue, it was a survival tactic. But even calmness felt like a concession now, a forced restraint in the face of blatant disrespect. The officer's assumptions were so transparent it felt almost absurd, yet there was nothing humorous about the situation. The judge could feel the weight of history pressing onto his shoulders, the countless stories of black men accused, questioned, doubted, criminalized for simply existing in places where others moved freely without scrutiny. The officer then circled the car, as if inspecting it for signs of theft, running his hand over the hood, peering through the windows. Looking for anything, any minor detail that could validate his suspicion. It didn't matter that the car was clean, undamaged, and legally registered. He was not seeking truth. He was seeking confirmation of a narrative he had already constructed. To him, the judge wasn't a respected figure, a legal mind, a leader. He was a suspect. As the officer continued his inspection, the judge stood at the rear of the vehicle, his hands clasped calmly in front of him, his expression stoic, but his thoughts racing. How many times had he seen similar situations unfold in the cases brought before him? How many times had defendants described almost identical encounters? He always believed them, but experiencing it firsthand brought the reality into sharp, painful focus. This was no longer a theoretical conversation on racial bias. It was happening to him on a quiet street without cause. Eventually, the officer returned, frustration simmering beneath the surface. Nothing he had done produced evidence of wrongdoing. Nothing justified the accusation lingering in his tone. And yet, instead of letting the situation de-escalate, he doubled down. "You're going to have to explain this again," he insisted. "How exactly did you come into possession of this car?" The phrasing was deliberate, as though the judge had stolen the vehicle rather than purchased it. The implication was clear. A man like you shouldn't own something like this. The judge could feel the insult sink deeper, not because he cared about proving his wealth or status, but because he understood the deeper message carried by that question. It was the same message generations of black Americans had heard, the same dismissal, the same disbelief, the same presumption of inferiority. He could have raised his voice. He could have revealed his title. He could have demanded the officer's badge number and ended the encounter right there. But he didn't. Part of him refused to use his position as a shield because the truth was bigger than that. The issue wasn't about who he was. It was about what the officer assumed he was. In a steady voice, the judge explained for the third time that the car was his, purchased legally and registered in his name. But repetition didn't change the officer's expression. The judge watched as the officer stepped back again, radioed something into his shoulder mic, and shook his head in disbelief, not because the facts were unclear, but because they didn't align with his expectations. And then, in that moment, the judge realized something profound. The officer didn't want clarity, he wanted validation. He wanted the world to mirror his biases. He wanted the suspicion he felt to transform into truth. In the absence of evidence, he resorted to assumption. In the presence of facts, he clung to narrative. The accusation, "This isn't your car," wasn't simply a question of ownership. It was a denial of identity. It was an erasure of accomplishment. It was a reminder of the fragile line between dignity and stereotype. And for a man who had dedicated his life to upholding justice, hearing such words from someone sworn to enforce the law struck a chord that resonated far beyond that roadside stop. The officer's doubt lingered in the air like a storm cloud that refused to move, thick and stubborn and charged with tension. But beneath that tension was something else, a moment approaching, one that neither man fully anticipated. It was the moment when the officer's assumptions, built on a shaky foundation of bias, would collide head-on with a truth he never considered. And like all moments of reckoning, it began quietly, almost unnoticeably, with a simple check of information. As the officer retreated again to his patrol car, registration and license in hand, the judge stood still at the rear of his vehicle. His posture was straight, shoulders squared but relaxed, an image of calm endurance. On the outside, he looked composed, almost serene, but inside, behind that practiced composure, emotions swirled, frustration, disbelief, and a sense of exhaustion that was far too familiar. This wasn't the first time he'd been misjudged, but it was, perhaps, the most symbolic. He breathed slowly, intentionally, trying to stay centered. He knew that in moments like this, perception was everything. A single gesture taken out of context could change the trajectory of an encounter. He had seen it happen before, from the bench, in news reports, in the stories told by countless defendants. Meanwhile, inside the patrol car, the officer tapped impatiently at the computer terminal. The routine check should have been simple: confirm the identity, match the registration, verify there were no outstanding issues. Yet as the judge's name appeared on the screen, the officer's eyebrows twitched in faint confusion. The name looked familiar, uncomfortably familiar. He squinted, trying to place it. He typed it into another system, then another. A profile popped up: a professional biography, legal history, significant rulings. And then, like a sudden jolt of electricity, recognition struck. He froze because staring back at him from the screen was not the profile of an average citizen, not a suspect, not a criminal, but a respected, widely known, and highly regarded state Supreme Court judge, one whose reputation extended far beyond the borders of the state, a man whose name was spoken in courtrooms, universities, law conferences, and legal journals, a man who had shaped state law with fairness and integrity, a man who, until this moment, the officer had unknowingly treated with suspicion and disrespect. The realization hit him all at once, quickly, heavily, and with the full weight of embarrassment. His posture shifted, his breath caught, his eyes darted back toward the judge, still standing calmly beside his car, unaware of the discovery that had just shattered the officer's certainty. The officer's heartbeat quickened, not from fear of danger, but from the sudden awareness of the magnitude of his mistake. He knew instantaneously what he had done. He knew the implications. And he knew there was no undoing the words he had spoken, the accusations he had made, or the assumptions he had projected. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the officer stepped out of his patrol car. His demeanor had changed. Gone was the assertive posture, the accusatory tone, the inflated suspicion. In its place was hesitation, thin, brittle, and unsteady. He approached the judge with measured steps, each one echoing the shift happening inside him. For the first time in the entire encounter, he saw the judge not as a stereotype, not as a threat, not as a question mark, but as a person. As a distinguished figure of the justice system, as someone who commanded respect not through intimidation, but through merit. "Sir," the officer began, voice notably softer, struggling to assemble a coherent sentence. I need to clarify something with you." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the embarrassment he tried desperately to hide. The judge simply looked at him, his expression unreadable, He wasn't angry, he wasn't smug, he wasn't relieved. He was simply waiting to see how the officer would choose to navigate the consequences of his own assumptions. The officer continued, "Your name, it came back in the system. It says you're a judge, a state Supreme Court judge." The words left his lips with an awkward mixture of disbelief and regret. His tone softened further, shifting into an almost apologetic cadence. The judge nodded once calmly. "Yes," he replied evenly, "I am." The officer's face flushed. He swallowed hard, as if trying to push down the lump of guilt rising in his throat. I didn't realize," he stammered. "I didn't know." The judge cut him off gently but firmly. "You didn't need to know," he said. A simple statement, but powerful because it spoke to the heart of the issue. Respect, fairness, and proper conduct should not depend on a title. They should not hinge on someone's status. They should not be conditional. Yet the sudden shift in the officer's behavior made it clear that, in his mind, status was everything. The officer looked down, ashamed. He tried to regain composure, clearing his throat, straightening his uniform, attempting to salvage what little authority remained. "Well, everything seems to check out. You're free to go," he said, the words falling flat, stripped of the dominance he once projected. The judge didn't move. He stood there, his gaze steady, allowing the silence to settle between them. It wasn't a silence filled with anger or resentment. It was a silence filled with truth, an unspoken understanding of what had transpired, what it said about bias, and how easily dignity can be eroded when assumptions overshadow fact. For a moment, the officer seemed to brace himself, as if expecting backlash, but none came. The judge simply said, "Have a good day, officer," his tone measured, almost gentle in its restraint. But beneath that calm surface lay a profound disappointment, not just in the officer, but in a system that had allowed such a moment to happen. The officer nodded awkwardly, stepping back, unsure where to place his hands or his eyes. He had discovered the truth, but the truth had revealed something about him as well, something he couldn't ignore, something he would remember long after the judge drove away. And as the judge returned to his vehicle, closing the door quietly behind him, he felt a mixture of relief and heaviness. Relief that the encounter had ended safely, heaviness that it had happened at all. Because in the end, the officer's realization didn't erase the experience. It didn't erase the accusation. It didn't erase the sting of hearing, "This isn't your car." What it revealed, painfully, unmistakably, was how deeply rooted bias can shape perception long before truth is allowed to speak. The air felt heavier in the minutes that followed the officer's realization. It was as if the world had paused, not out of fear or danger, but out of a quiet, awkward reckoning. The officer stood beside the judge's car, shifting uncomfortably, trapped between the protocol he had followed and the reality he had just discovered. His confidence, once rigid and sharp, had collapsed into a fragile unease. He fumbled with his words, trying to form sentences that could smooth over what had occurred, though both men knew nothing could truly undo it. "Sir, I want to apologize," the officer finally said, his voice low and brittle. The words hung in the air weakly, like an offering that didn't quite know how to land. It wasn't a confident apology. It wasn't clear or direct or rooted in genuine understanding. It was rushed, unsteady, spoken more out of discomfort than reflection. The judge watched him carefully, the faintest trace of exhaustion flickering across his eyes. He had heard apologies like this before, apologies that acknowledged inconvenience, not injustice, apologies that addressed embarrassment, not behavior, apologies aimed at avoiding consequences rather than confronting truth. The judge didn't respond immediately. Silence stretched between them, calm but undeniable, forcing the officer to stand in the weight of his own actions. A dog barked in the distance. A car passed by slowly, its driver glancing curiously at the scene. Life around them continued, oblivious to the tension that had unfolded on that quiet stretch of road. "I didn't know who you were," the officer added quickly, as if that explanation could somehow justify the treatment he had given. But that was the problem. The judge's expression tightened subtly, not in anger but in disappointment. That sentence, "I didn't know who you were," perfectly captured the officer's mindset. The implication was undeniable. The judge deserved respect only because of his title, not because he was a human being. The officer still didn't grasp the true issue. Judge finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable weight of moral clarity. "Officer, respect shouldn't depend on who someone is," he said quietly. "It should depend on the fact that they're a person." The officer inhaled sharply, the point hitting him with a force more powerful than anger could have delivered. The judge wasn't raising his voice. He didn't need to. His words, measured and precise, carried the authority of someone who had spent years weighing the consequences of actions from the bench. "They were not meant to shame, but to teach." The officer opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He closed it again, swallowing hard, the reality settling deeper into him. For the first time since the stop began, he truly looked at the judge not as a suspect, not as a name on a license, but as a man who had endured something he shouldn't have had to. The officer's shoulders slumped, his bravado evaporating. He seemed smaller now, not physically, but psychologically, as if the weight of the encounter had compressed him. "I was just doing my job," the officer said after a moment, his voice barely above a whisper. It was a common refrain, one often used to deflect accountability, but in this moment, the judge didn't allow it to pass without reflection. He shook his head gently. "Doing your job doesn't mean ignoring what you see. It doesn't mean assuming the worst." His voice remained soft, but every syllable carried a quiet truth the officer couldn't ignore. A long pause followed, not an awkward one, but a reflective one. The officer looked down at the ground, kicking lightly at the asphalt with the toe of his boot. The judge stood still, composed as ever, hands folded in front of him, an image of dignity that seemed even more pronounced after the ordeal. Eventually, the officer extended the documents, the license and registration, his hand trembling slightly. "Here, sir," he said. The judge took them gently, brushing no more than fingertips against the officer's hand. The contact was brief but significant. In that moment, the judge wasn't simply reclaiming his documents. He was reclaiming his dignity piece by piece. As the judge moved to return to his car, the officer spoke once more, his voice cracking with sincerity this time. "I really am sorry," he said. "I didn't mean—" He didn't finish the sentence. Perhaps he didn't know how to. Perhaps he realized the sentence couldn't be completed honestly. The judge paused with his car door open, turning back to look at the officer. "I understand you may not have meant harm," he said calmly, "but intention doesn't erase impact." It was a simple truth, but one that carried the weight of centuries of history, discrimination, and pain. The officer nodded slowly, understanding, or starting to. For the first time, he looked genuinely humbled. The judge got into his car, closing the door gently, quietly. As he sat there for a moment before starting the engine, he felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over him. Relief that the encounter hadn't escalated, sadness that it had happened at all, frustration that the officer's treatment of him only shifted after learning his identity, and beneath it all, a deep, heavy weariness, a reminder that even a man of his position was not immune to assumptions rooted in race. Outside, the officer stood motionless, watching the car, not out of suspicion anymore but contemplation. Something in his expression had changed. The rigidity was gone, the certainty had dissolved. What remained was a raw awareness, a realization that he had participated in something harmful, something unjust, even if unintentionally. He seemed to understand that this moment would linger with him far longer than a routine stop normally would. As the judge finally switched on the engine and pulled into the road, the tires rolling smoothly over the pavement, he didn't glance back. He didn't need to. The encounter was over, but the implications would echo far beyond those few minutes. For him, it was another reminder of the bias he had fought against in the courts. For the officer, it was a wake-up call, one that would likely shape how he approached his job from that day forward. And for the community watching from a distance, those peeking through windows, those passing by, those who would later hear the story, it was a powerful, unsettling example of how fragile fairness can be when prejudice steps into the driver's seat. When the judge drove away from the scene, he expected the incident to remain just that, a private encounter, a moment of personal frustration, one more experience tucked quietly into the long narrative of racial profiling that so many Black Americans have lived through. But fate had other plans. Unbeknownst to him, several people in the neighborhood had witnessed the exchange from a distance. Some had recorded portions from their porches or car windows. Others had simply watched, uneasy, silently hoping that the confrontation remained verbal and never turned violent. And when the judge left, The silence that followed didn't stay contained. It began spreading, first through whispers, then through conversations, then through the unstoppable momentum of the digital age. The first spark came from a short video clip uploaded by a passerby. Just 20 seconds long, it captured the officer questioning the judge with an unmistakable tone of suspicion. It didn't show titles or names or explanations, just a black man being pressed to explain the ownership of his own vehicle. The clip spread fast, gaining traction within hours. Comments flooded in, many expressing anger, disbelief, exhaustion. People didn't need to know who the man was. The behavior in the video was all too familiar. It was the kind of footage that sparked recognition because versions of it had appeared countless times before. People knew the pattern, they knew the implications. Then someone who recognized the judge posted his name. The revelation hit social media like a shockwave. The man in the video wasn't just any driver, he was a state Supreme Court judge, a nationally respected legal mind, a man known for championing civil rights and fairness in the legal system. And suddenly, the story was no longer a moment. It was a symbol. The conversation shifted from frustration to outrage, from confusion to clarity. If this could happen to a man with such stature and influence, what hope did ordinary citizens have? Within days, the story was everywhere, local news first, then statewide outlets, then national platforms. Headlines appeared across multiple networks, each one punctuating the alarming truth of what had occurred. Phrases like racial profiling allegation, judge detained without cause, and police bias under scrutiny filled the news cycle. The judge's photograph, calm, dignified, composed, appeared alongside images from the video. The contrast between his respected public identity and the treatment he endured during the stop sparked heated discussions across the country. At barbershops, on college campuses, in living rooms and workplaces, people dissected the footage, analyzing each detail, each tone, each gesture. The incident became a point of reference in conversations about policing, systemic bias, and racial assumptions. Supporters of the judge praised his composure and restraint. Critics of the officer questioned the training protocols that allowed such treatment to occur. And everyday citizens, those who had experienced similar encounters, though far from the spotlight, shared their own stories, finding comfort in being heard, even if belatedly. The law community reacted strongly as well. Real dialogue, not the kind that appears only in speeches or political statements, but the kind sparked by genuine outrage and the need for change. Community leaders organized forums. Civil rights activists held rallies. Local residents, energized by the moment, demanded better training, stronger accountability measures, and more diverse hiring practices. The judge's experience became a catalyst, one that reignited long-standing conversations about race, authority, and justice. For the judge himself, watching the story unfold was surreal. He hadn't expected the incident to reach the public. He hadn't asked for a spotlight, but the more the story grew, the more he realized it was no longer about him. It was about the community, the system, and the greater meaning behind what he had endured. The message had outgrown the moment. It had become part of something bigger. And though he hadn't yet spoken publicly, he knew he soon would have to. Because the story wasn't just about a traffic stop gone wrong. It was about what happens when bias meets authority. It was about the vulnerability that persists even at the highest levels of success. It was about a system that still struggles to see all its citizens with equal clarity. As the dust settled from this extraordinary incident, one thing became clear. What happened on that quiet stretch of road was far more than a traffic stop. It was a mirror reflecting long-standing issues of bias, perception, and human judgment. The fact that a state Supreme Court judge, a person whose job is to uphold fairness, justice, and the rule of law, could be treated as a suspect in his own vehicle is more than shocking. It is a wake-up call. It forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about systemic assumptions and the ways they infiltrate our daily interactions. And it reminds us, as a society, that status, respect, or personal achievement should never be the deciding factor in how someone is treated. Equality under the law is not just a principle to be applied in courtrooms. It is a principle that should be evident every time someone steps behind the wheel, walks down the street, or interacts with authority. For the officer involved, the incident became a moment of profound self-reflection, the recognition that assumptions had guided his actions and that those assumptions had been harmful, offered both embarrassment and opportunity. Accountability in these moments is not merely about punishment, it is about learning, growing, and committing to doing better. The officer's eventual acknowledgement, however imperfect, showed that even small moments of self-awareness can be the first steps toward meaningful change. Yet this encounter also highlighted a broader issue. While individual reflection is valuable, it cannot replace structural reform, comprehensive training, and institutional policies that actively address bias. One traffic stop, even one with a high-profile individual, cannot fix a system, but it can illuminate where the system fails. For the judge, the experience was deeply personal, but he chose to transform it into a teaching moment. By sharing his story publicly, he offered insight not just into his ordeal, but into the everyday realities faced by millions of people whose experiences are rarely validated. His measured response, combining calmness with moral clarity, reminded the public that resilience is not passive. It is active, intentional, and necessary. His voice became a lens through which the nation could examine how authority, race, and perception intersect, and it challenged viewers to consider their own roles in reinforcing or dismantling systemic bias. The public reaction underscored the power of visibility. The community, once aware of the incident, engaged in a dialogue that was long overdue. Social media amplified voices that might otherwise have been unheard. News outlets, commentary programs, and citizen forums all contributed to a national conversation about fairness, assumptions, and justice. People began asking difficult questions. How many times do ordinary citizens experience similar treatment but lack the visibility or platform to highlight it? How do stereotypes shape interactions even among well-trained professionals? And crucially, how do we ensure that lessons from one high-profile encounter lead to widespread change, rather than fading as just another headline? This story also illustrates the human element behind policy discussions. Bias is not only embedded in institutions, it exists in the decisions we make every day, often unconsciously. Each individual encounter, whether on a road, in a workplace, or in a courtroom, shapes experiences and perceptions in profound ways. By reflecting on this incident, society is reminded that justice is not only a legal concept, but a human one. Respect, empathy, and fairness are not abstract ideals, they are obligations in every interaction. And while the judge's position granted him a platform, the principle applies universally. Everyone deserves recognition of their humanity before assumptions are made. As we reflect on this story, the lessons are clear. First, awareness of bias is essential. Recognizing when assumptions color our perceptions is the first step toward dismantling them. Second, accountability matters. Both personal and institutional responsibility are critical in preventing harm and fostering trust. Third, composure and courage are powerful tools. The judge's measured response illustrates that resilience and dignity can influence not only immediate outcomes, but also the broader societal narrative. And finally, the story reminds us that change often begins with dialogue, honest, uncomfortable, and necessary conversations about race, authority, and human dignity. At this point, it's worth considering how we, as individuals and as a society, respond to these moments. Do we dismiss them as isolated incidents, or do we see them as a reflection of deeper systemic patterns that require thoughtful action? The choice is ours. Stories like this one are not just news, they are calls to conscience. They challenge us to evaluate our own assumptions, to educate ourselves and others, and to advocate for policies and practices that reinforce fairness, equality, and respect for all people. They remind us that justice is a living, breathing concept, shaped not just by laws, but by the actions of every individual who engages with one another. For viewers of this channel, for those who have followed the story, and for anyone seeking understanding, the takeaway is both sobering and empowering. It is sobering because it exposes how quickly assumptions can harm, even in seemingly ordinary circumstances. It is empowering because awareness and reflection are the first steps toward meaningful change. We have the ability to shape interactions, influence perceptions, and challenge systems that perpetuate inequity. By engaging thoughtfully, questioning assumptions, and amplifying voices that demand fairness, we contribute to a society that honors justice not only in principle but in practice. Once the story had captured national attention, the spotlight inevitably turned toward the police department involved. While some officers and spokespersons attempted to frame the encounter as routine, the public scrutiny made it clear that routine could no longer serve as an excuse. A department that once operated quietly behind standard operating procedures was now under the watchful eyes of journalists, legal analysts, civil rights advocates, and everyday citizens. The internal investigation, initially procedural and slow, became a topic of public debate. How would the department assess the officer's behavior? How would they address both his assumptions and the way he carried them out? Could they show accountability without appearing defensive or dismissive? From the start, it was obvious that the investigation would be more than a formality. Citizens demanded transparency. Local government officials, aware that the optics of inaction could erode trust, urged swift action. Even within the department, some officers quietly acknowledged that the encounter had gone beyond acceptable bounds. Training protocols and implicit bias workshops were discussed at emergency meetings, but the deeper question loomed. Could these structural measures prevent the kind of judgmental, assumption-based interaction that had occurred? The incident became a case study not only for the department, but for law enforcement nationwide, highlighting the systemic need for accountability and education. Legal oversight bodies, too, weighed in. Professional review boards, internal affairs units, and even state-level law enforcement commissions began monitoring the case closely. Analysts emphasized the danger of allowing individual discretion to override factual verification. This stop wasn't an isolated problem. It was emblematic of how implicit bias can infiltrate routine decision-making, even when officers are following procedural checklists. The contrast between assumption and reality in this case became a teaching point. The officer had not merely misread documents or failed to check records. He had interpreted identity through the lens of racial bias. This subtle yet profound error sparked debates about ethics, training, and systemic reform across the country. The public, meanwhile, was not content to wait quietly for the results of internal review. Social media campaigns, petitions, and community forums amplified the conversation. People questioned whether disciplinary measures would truly reflect the severity of the officer's judgment errors. They debated whether policy changes would be substantive or symbolic. And in this swirl of attention, the incident transformed from a singular event into a broader discussion of policing culture, accountability, and public trust. The judge's encounter became a touchstone, a story that both exposed and demanded resolution for larger systemic issues. The department eventually issued a formal statement acknowledging the officer's misjudgment. They emphasized that the encounter had been reviewed and that corrective action would follow. Yet even in carefully worded announcements, tension remained. How much of the response addressed the human cost of the interaction versus the procedural obligation to appear thorough and fair? For observers, the question lingered. Would a black man with less social, political, and legal influence have received the same attention and concern? The story became a mirror, reflecting both progress and ongoing inequities in institutional accountability. From a legal standpoint, the incident offered fertile ground for discussion. Lawyers, civil rights advocates, and academics dissected the encounter, examining the officer's actions in light of existing laws, departmental policies, and constitutional protections. They debated the boundaries of authority, the role of implicit bias in legal outcomes, and the mechanisms available to hold law enforcement accountable for errors rooted in assumption rather than evidence. The encounter illustrated that the law, while ostensibly neutral, is applied by humans who carry biases, assumptions, and preconceptions into every interaction. This realization drove further discourse. If a Supreme Court judge could be misjudged, what safeguards exist for ordinary citizens? At the community level, responses were equally nuanced. Some citizens expressed outrage, citing the stop as evidence of persistent racial profiling. Others sought understanding, acknowledging the stress and pressure officers face while emphasizing the need for empathy and accountability on all sides. This spectrum of response underscored the complexity of the issue. Bias is not merely a moral failing, it is a systemic phenomenon requiring education, reflection, and policy intervention. It is not resolved with simple apologies, but through consistent, measurable change. In this context, the officer's own experience became a point of reflection. Whether through formal counseling, sensitivity training, or personal contemplation, he was confronted with the consequences of assumptions unchecked by fact. The public and institutional attention created a framework for his own accountability, one that extended beyond the immediate encounter to the broader implications of every decision he would make in the future. For the judge, observing the process reinforced the dual reality of his role. He could catalyze change by telling his story, but systemic reform required multiple stakeholders, from law enforcement leadership to community advocacy groups, to act in concert. Ultimately, the response of the department and the legal oversight bodies illuminated both hope and challenge. Hope, because the system could recognize error and initiate corrective action. Challenge, because the same systems had to wrestle with deeply ingrained bias that no single policy change could fully eradicate. The incident underscored that accountability is not just reactive, it must be proactive, continuous, and rooted in understanding human behavior, social context, and the ethical responsibilities of authority. What happened here serves as both a cautionary tale and a roadmap. Errors rooted in assumption are preventable, but only if they are recognized, examined, and addressed with transparency and integrity. Beyond the courtroom, beyond the police department, and beyond the initial viral story, the incident resonated on a much larger scale. It became a mirror reflecting society's ongoing struggle with bias, assumptions, and fairness. The image of a highly respected state Supreme Court judge being treated as a suspect in his own car sparked a nationwide conversation, not just about policing, but about how every individual, consciously or unconsciously, contributes to systemic inequities. Across communities, people began examining their own assumptions, the subtle ways they judged strangers, colleagues, and neighbors before knowing their stories. It was a sobering realization that bias is not just institutional, it is personal, embedded in thought patterns, social interactions, and cultural norms. Schools and universities seized upon the story as a teaching moment. Social studies and ethics classes used the incident to discuss implicit bias, racial profiling, and the importance of equitable treatment. Law schools dissected the encounter in seminars, highlighting how even experienced professionals can be misjudged, and how the principles of justice extend beyond the courtroom into everyday life. Students debated not only the officer's conduct, but society's broader responsibility to recognize and correct bias before it manifests as action. This dialogue, sparked by a single event, became a catalyst for education and awareness, emphasizing that reflection and understanding are essential first steps towards systemic change. Community groups organized forums, discussions, and panels focused on the lessons learned. These gatherings were not merely about assigning blame, they were about examining patterns and fostering accountability at every level. Participants shared personal experiences that echoed the judge's encounter, revealing how racial profiling and assumptions are common, persistent, and psychologically damaging. The story empowered people to speak, to document, and to insist that fairness should not be contingent upon status or social standing. Ordinary citizens realized that their voices mattered and that collective awareness could pressure institutions to act more conscientiously and transparently. Social media played an undeniable role in amplifying the message. Hashtags, posts, and comment threads became spaces where individuals exchanged insights, recounted similar experiences, and called for systemic reform. The viral nature of the incident ensured that the conversation reached far beyond the immediate community or even the state. People in distant cities and states, who may never have experienced such an encounter themselves, confronted the reality of bias through the lens of this high-profile example. It reminded the public that inequity is not always visible, but it is pervasive, and that acknowledging it is the first step toward change. At the same time, the story prompted reflection within law enforcement agencies nationwide. Police departments revisited training programs, focusing not only on procedure, but on the psychological and social factors that influence judgment. Sensitivity, de-escalation, and awareness of implicit bias became central topics. Leaders recognized that accountability was not limited to disciplinary measures. It required proactive education, mentoring, and cultural shifts that address the root causes of misjudgment. The incident demonstrated that when assumptions go unchallenged, even a routine stop can escalate into a symbolic and sometimes devastating moment of injustice. The media coverage further highlighted the duality of progress and ongoing struggle. While some outlets praised the judge's composure and the officer's eventual acknowledgement, others emphasized the deeper societal issues at play. Editorials debated whether high-profile attention would lead to meaningful change or fade as another viral story replaced it. Columnists questioned whether systems of accountability could respond consistently across cases, especially for those without the judge's platform or visibility. The debate illuminated a critical reality. Public awareness is powerful, but sustained change requires vigilance, advocacy, and institutional willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Psychologically, the story resonated because it illustrated the human cost of assumptions. The judge's calm demeanor, while admirable, belied the emotional toll such encounters exact. Stress, frustration, indignity, and the subtle erosion of dignity affect individuals profoundly, even if the situation resolves without violence. Experts weighed in, discussing how repeated exposure to biased treatment can have lasting effects on mental health, self-perception, and trust in institutions. The incident became a lens through which society could understand that bias is not abstract, it is felt, internalized, and lived. Recognizing this human dimension was crucial for developing empathy and fostering genuine reform. For ordinary citizens, the story became a call to responsibility. It challenged viewers to consider not only the actions of others, but their own behavior in everyday interactions. How often do we judge based on appearance, assumption, or incomplete information? How often do we act on those judgments, consciously or unconsciously, in ways that affect someone else's dignity? The incident offered a stark reminder that equality is not passive. It requires intentionality. It requires awareness, reflection, and a commitment to treat every individual with fairness, regardless of background, status, or identity. Ultimately, the societal reflections sparked by this story emphasize that change is a shared responsibility. Institutions must enforce equitable practices. Individuals must examine their biases. Communities must foster dialogue and demand accountability. Media and education systems must continue highlighting examples that provoke reflection and awareness. Together, these actions create a framework in which encounters like the one involving the judge can serve as catalysts for positive transformation, rather than simply moments of outrage or fleeting attention. This section underscores the broader lessons society can learn when a single incident is magnified, analyzed, and understood. It is a reminder that justice is not only a legal principle, but a social responsibility. The story challenges viewers to not only witness the injustice, but to internalize its lessons, to consider how they can contribute to a culture that resists bias and upholds dignity. And as we move into Section 13, we will explore how individuals and communities can take actionable steps inspired by this incident to prevent similar injustices in the future. The story of the judge's traffic stop is not just a cautionary tale, it is also a blueprint for action. While awareness and discussion are critical, they must be paired with tangible steps that prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. Communities, law enforcement agencies, and individuals all have roles to play. At the most immediate level, community engagement is essential. Neighborhood groups, local organizations, and civic leaders can organize forums, workshops, and discussions that address bias, assumptions, and procedural fairness. These gatherings create spaces for citizens to share experiences, educate one another, and develop collective strategies to hold institutions accountable. When dialogue moves from online debate to face-to-face conversation. It transforms from a reaction into a plan for lasting change. Law enforcement agencies, in particular, can take proactive measures. Training programs that go beyond technical procedures and into the realm of implicit bias, cultural awareness, and empathy are essential. Officers need to understand how assumptions, no matter how subtle, influence behavior and decision-making. Scenario-based training that simulates real-life encounters, including interactions with individuals of varying social, economic, and professional backgrounds, helps officers recognize the difference between perception and reality. Policies must also reinforce accountability, not only punishing misconduct, but actively rewarding practices that prioritize fairness, observation over assumption, and de-escalation over confrontation. When officers are equipped with both knowledge and a clear moral framework, the likelihood of harmful encounters decreases significantly. Community members themselves can contribute to change by documenting experiences and holding systems accountable. Technology provides powerful tools. Video recordings, social media, and citizen reporting can shed light on interactions that might otherwise go unnoticed. The key is not sensationalism, but responsible and accurate documentation. When communities actively participate in oversight, they create pressure for transparency and reform, making it more difficult for bias to go unchecked. At the same time, dialogue should emphasize empathy for all parties. Constructive engagement acknowledges the human capacity for error while demanding that it be corrected, creating an environment where accountability and growth coexist. Education also plays a pivotal role. Schools, universities, and professional institutions can integrate lessons from incidents like this into curricula, emphasizing ethical decision-making, social responsibility, and the real-world consequences of assumptions. Case studies of high-profile events allow students to explore complex issues like racial bias, authority, and human rights in concrete terms. When young people are equipped with awareness and critical thinking skills, they are better prepared to act ethically in their own lives, both personally and professionally. Over time, this proactive approach builds a culture where fairness and reflection are not optional, but expected. Legislative and policy-level interventions are equally important. Governments can implement measures that ensure officers are regularly evaluated on fairness, adherence to protocol, and understanding of bias. Public reporting mechanisms, oversight commissions, and accountability boards create transparency, making it clear that errors rooted in assumption are not acceptable. These structures reinforce the message that systemic change requires both individual responsibility and institutional commitment. By combining policy, training, and community engagement, society creates multiple layers of protection against the recurrence of unjust treatment. At the heart of all these actions is the principle of empathy. The judge's calm response to being misjudged serves as a powerful example. Dignity, patience, and reflection can transform a negative encounter into an educational opportunity. Individuals in positions of influence can use their platforms to amplify these lessons, ensuring that stories like this do more than shock, they instruct. At the same time, society as a whole must commit to ongoing reflection. Bias is not eradicated overnight. It requires vigilance, honesty, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths in daily life. Every citizen has a role to play in examining their assumptions and ensuring that others are treated with fairness and respect. Ultimately, Section 13 reminds viewers that action is both collective and personal. Change begins with conversation, but must be reinforced with intentional steps: community engagement, professional training, documentation, education, and policy reform. These measures create a cycle where awareness leads to accountability, accountability leads to trust, and trust strengthens the fabric of society. The judge's experience, while deeply personal, becomes a blueprint for how we might respond to injustice, not with despair, but with purposeful, sustained action. And as we move into Section 14, we will explore how the story continues to resonate today, reflecting ongoing efforts, evolving perceptions, and the long-term impact of a single moment in time. Even months after the traffic stop, the story of the judge continues to resonate, serving as a stark reminder that individual experiences can illuminate systemic issues. What began as a single, tense encounter has evolved into a catalyst for ongoing conversation, reflection, and action. Its impact is not limited to those who witnessed the incident firsthand or to the legal and law enforcement communities. It has rippled across society, prompting people to examine the assumptions that influence behavior in every corner of daily life. From casual observers to policymakers, from students to seasoned professionals, the story compels society to confront the uncomfortable truth that bias is persistent, subtle, and often invisible until exposed by extraordinary circumstances. The incident's lasting impact is evident in multiple spheres. Within law enforcement, the story prompted departments across the country to reassess training programs, reevaluate accountability mechanisms, and prioritize awareness of implicit bias. Officers are increasingly encouraged to consider context, check assumptions against facts, and recognize the humanity of those they interact with. Policies have been updated in some jurisdictions to include scenario-based training that reflects diverse social and professional identities, mirroring the very circumstances that led to the judge's misjudgment. This evolution signals a growing acknowledgement that the consequences of unchecked bias are not theoretical, they are lived, and they can affect anyone, regardless of status or profession. Media and public discourse have continued to highlight the incident as a reference point for discussions about racial profiling and systemic inequities. Analysts, journalists, and commentators often cite the encounter when examining broader patterns of discrimination in everyday life. Educational programs incorporate the story as a case study, emphasizing critical thinking, ethical judgment, and social responsibility. The story's prominence ensures that it remains a teaching tool, not just a viral moment, influencing how future generations understand authority, fairness, and personal accountability. In classrooms, workshops, and professional development settings, the incident reinforces the message that bias, when unexamined, can override justice even in the most controlled or prestigious environments. Beyond institutional change, the judge's experience has sparked a cultural dialogue about dignity, resilience, and the human cost of bias. People across communities relate to the story because it reflects experiences they have endured in less visible, less publicized ways. The narrative validates their frustration, giving voice to the countless individuals who face assumptions and stereotypes in their daily lives. In this way, the story becomes more than a single event. It becomes a symbol of a larger societal challenge. It is a touchstone for discussions about equality, fairness, and the responsibility of every individual to confront assumptions before acting upon them. The story also demonstrates the power of visibility in driving change. The judge's prominence ensured that the incident received attention, but it also highlights a sobering reality. Many encounters like this occur without witnesses, without media coverage, and without resulting in systemic reflection. By examining the incident in public, society gains insight into patterns that might otherwise remain hidden. It forces the question, how many similar incidents go unnoticed, unaddressed, and uncorrected? This awareness motivates citizens, advocacy groups, and institutions to push for proactive measures that go beyond responding to a single, high-profile case. At a societal level, the story encourages ongoing dialogue about race, authority, and justice. It challenges individuals to recognize that assumptions are often subconscious, and that reflection is a critical first step toward fairness. Families, workplaces, schools, and civic organizations have begun incorporating discussions about bias and accountability into their routines, prompted by stories like this one. The encounter reminds society that justice is not a static concept. It is lived, practiced, and maintained through continuous awareness and action. Each conversation, each reflection, each intentional decision to check assumptions reinforces a culture that values equity and dignity. Importantly, the judge's story also illustrates the enduring role of courage and composure. While the encounter was unfair and stressful, his response, calm, informed, and measured, transformed a negative situation into a teachable moment. It reminds viewers that dignity in the face of injustice can amplify awareness, foster empathy, and inspire reform. The incident, therefore, is not solely about error or wrongdoing. It is also about the human capacity to turn adversity into opportunity for reflection, education, and change. The narrative encourages society to see challenges not only as obstacles, but as catalysts for growth. As we reflect on the lasting impact, it becomes evident that the story is not a closed chapter. It continues to shape perceptions, policies, and behaviors. The lessons extend beyond law enforcement and legal institutions. They reach every individual who interacts with others, consciously or unconsciously, through judgment and assumption. The story compels a commitment to vigilance, to monitor behavior, to question preconceptions, and to act when bias is recognized. It underscores the ongoing responsibility each person bears in creating a society that values fairness, equality, and human dignity above all else. As we bring this story to a close, it is clear that the encounter between a state Supreme Court judge and a police officer is far more than an isolated incident. It is a lens through which we can examine the deeper currents of society. The events of that day illuminate the power of assumptions, the subtle yet pervasive nature of bias, and the critical importance of empathy, awareness, and accountability. We have witnessed how a single moment can ripple outward, influencing public discourse, inspiring institutional reflection, and shaping the consciousness of entire communities. What began as a routine traffic stop escalated into a national conversation, challenging individuals and institutions alike to confront uncomfortable truths and to take action that goes beyond mere words. The lessons from this story are both personal and collective. On an individual level, it reminds each of us to pause before judging, to seek clarity before acting, and to recognize the humanity in every person we encounter. The judge's calm and measured response demonstrates the transformative power of dignity and reflection, illustrating that even in the face of injustice, one can turn adversity into an opportunity to educate, to inspire, and to foster change. On a systemic level, the incident underscores the responsibility of institutions to implement policies, training, and oversight that actively counteract bias. Accountability cannot be symbolic. It must be meaningful, consistent, and ongoing. The story challenges society to recognize that equality and fairness are not abstract ideals. They are daily practices that require vigilance, intention, and courage. Perhaps the most important takeaway is that awareness must lead to action. Conversation alone is not enough. Reflection without change risks becoming performative. Communities must continue to engage in dialogue, advocate for reform, and hold institutions accountable for how authority is exercised. Individuals must examine their own assumptions, confront biases, and intervene when they see injustice. Policymakers and organizational leaders must create structures that prevent, detect, and correct errors born of prejudice. When these efforts converge, society moves closer to a reality in which fairness and dignity are not privileges granted to a few, but rights upheld for all. For viewers of Swift Tale, the story carries a personal invitation. Consider how you interact with others, whether in everyday encounters, professional settings, or social environments. Reflect on the assumptions you might make unconsciously and the ways these assumptions influence behavior. Engage in conversations with friends, family, and colleagues about bias and fairness. Educate yourself and others about systemic inequities and the steps that can be taken to correct them. Share stories, amplify voices, and participate actively in creating a culture of empathy and accountability. Each of these actions, no matter how small, contributes to a collective shift toward justice and understanding. And as always, your engagement matters. If you found this story enlightening, challenging, or thought-provoking, like, share, and subscribe to Swift Tale so more people can learn from stories that reveal truth, justice, and the human experience. Comment below to share your thoughts, your experiences, or the lessons you've drawn from this story. Every voice adds to the dialogue, strengthens the community, and helps transform awareness into action. Your participation ensures that the lessons of this encounter reach beyond the screen and into everyday life, creating a ripple effect of understanding, empathy, and accountability. Finally, the story reminds us that even in moments of injustice, there is hope. hope that awareness leads to change, that dialogue fosters understanding, and that courage can transform personal experience into collective insight. It is a call to vigilance, responsibility, and reflection. By examining our assumptions, advocating for fairness, and holding both ourselves and institutions accountable, we contribute to a society that honors justice not only in principle, but in practice. The judge's experience is a stark reminder, yes, of what can go wrong, but it is equally a testament to what can be learned, what can be corrected, and what can inspire generations to act with fairness, dignity, and empathy. In the end, this is more than a traffic stop. It is a story of reflection, resilience, and responsibility. And it is a challenge to every viewer, every citizen, and every institution to ensure that fairness is not an aspiration but a reality, upheld every day in every interaction and for every individual.